Right now, there are roughly 8 billion people on Earth, and if you could somehow look into the eyes of every single one of them, one at a time, you'd notice something strange. About 3/4 of them, maybe more, would be looking back at you with brown eyes. Not blue, not green, not grey. Brown. The colour that almost nobody thinks about. The colour that never shows up in songs or poems about beautiful eyes. The colour that's so common it's invisible. But here's what's wild. Those brown eyes aren't just common by accident. They're not just the statistical winner in some genetic lottery. Brown eyes are the original, the ancestral colour. The shade that's been staring out of human faces for perhaps 500,000 years or more, carried forward through every ice age, every migration, every near-extinction event, every triumph and disaster in the entire story of our species. We live in a world that's obsessed with rare eye colours. Blue eyes get all the attention. Green eyes are called exotic, mysterious, enchanting. Grey eyes show up in fantasy novels. Amber eyes get compared to gold or honey or autumn leaves. There are entire subreddits dedicated to unusual eye colours. Entire beauty industries built around making brown eyes look less brown. But the truly extraordinary story, the one that connects you to deep time in a way almost nothing else can, belongs to brown. Because when the first modern humans walked out of Africa, maybe 60,000 or 70,000 years ago, they had brown eyes. When Neanderthals hunted mammoths across frozen Europe, they almost certainly had brown eyes. When our species was reduced to barely 1,000 individuals during that catastrophic bottleneck 900,000 years ago, every single one of those survivors looked out at their dying world through dark irises. Brown wasn't just the most common eye colour in human history. For hundreds of thousands of years it was the only colour. The mutations that created blue eyes, green eyes, all the lighter shades we think of as special, those came later. Much later. They're evolutionary newcomers, carved out of a brown baseline by tiny genetic accidents that happened relatively recently in our story. Some researchers think the blue eye mutation might be less than 10,000 years old. Others push it back further, maybe 50,000 years. But even at the oldest estimates, that's nothing, a blink. Brown eyes were already ancient when blue eyes first appeared. If you're listening to this to fall asleep, good. That's exactly why I make these. And before we go deeper, I'm curious, where are you right now and what time is it? Drop a comment. I love seeing Berlin at breakfast, Sydney at sunset, Chicago at 2 a.m, all at once. It's like a map of the world drawn in insomnia and curiosity. So tonight, we're going to tell the story that nobody tells. The story of the colour you never think about. We're going to trace brown eyes backward through time, through genetics and migration, and ice ages and ancient DNA. We're going to talk about melanin and chromosomes and what it means when a trait is dominant. We're going to visit the myths and the science, the cultures that worshipped dark eyes and the ones that didn't, the adaptations that made brown eyes useful under harsh suns and the accidents that created lighter shades in the north. And we're going to connect your reflection in the mirror, right now, to people who lived so long ago that their world would be completely unrecognizable to you. People who never saw a city or a wheel or a written word. People who survived things that should have killed them. People whose eyes, genetically speaking, might have looked almost exactly like yours. Because if you have brown eyes, and statistically most of you do, you're carrying something unbroken. A genetic signature that runs in a direct line back further than language, further than agriculture, further than art. You're looking at the world through the same colour lens that early humans used to scan savannas for predators and search the horizon for rain. And even if you don't have brown eyes, even if you're one of the minority with blue or green or hazel, your story still starts with brown. Every lighter eye colour is basically brown eyes with the pigment turned down. Mutations that reduced melanin production just enough to let different wavelengths of light scatter through the iris in new ways. So this isn't a story about common versus rare. It's a story about time, about continuity, about a 500,000-year thread that connects almost everyone alive today to the very beginning of what it means to be human. The colour you never think about turns out to be the colour that remembers everything. Let's start with the numbers, because sometimes the simplest facts are the most astonishing. If you gathered 1,000 people at random from across the planet, walked down the line and looked each one in the eye, somewhere between 550 and 790 of them would have brown eyes. The exact number depends on which surveys you trust, how you define brown versus hazel, whether you're sampling urban populations or remote villages. But the range doesn't matter. The pattern is unmistakable. Brown isn't just the most common eye colour, it's the overwhelmingly dominant one. Nothing else even comes close. Blue eyes. Maybe 80 to 100 people in your 1,000. Hazel, perhaps 50. Green, around 20. Grey, amber, and everything else combined, barely a handful. The rarer shades, the ones people write poems about, the eyes that supposedly hold oceans or forests or starlight. They're statistical noise. Beautiful noise, sure, but noise nonetheless. Brown is the baseline, the foundation, the colour that paints most of the human world. Now let's zoom out and see where those brown eyes actually are. Because they're not evenly distributed. Evolution doesn't work that way. Geography, ancestry, and 500,000 years of environmental pressure have created a map that tells you exactly where humanity spent most of its history. Start in sub-Saharan Africa. Nearly everyone has brown eyes, not 70% or 80%, closer to 100%, allowing for the occasional exception. From Senegal to Somalia, from the Congo to Cape Town, brown eyes are so universal that other colours barely register in population surveys. This makes perfect sense. This is where modern humans evolved, where we spent the first couple 100,000 years of our existence. Brown eyes aren't common here because they spread here. They're common because they started here. Move east into the Middle East and you see the same pattern. Brown dominates. Iran, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, nearly the entire region shows dark eyes as the overwhelming norm. A few lighter shades start appearing in some populations, particularly in areas with complex migration histories, but they're minority traits. Keep going into Asia, and the story continues. East Asia, brown, China, Korea, Japan, Mongolia. Populations in these regions show brown eyes in the vast majority, often above 90%. Southeast Asia, same thing. Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, the Philippines, brown eyes everywhere you look. South Asia, brown again. India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, more than 3/4 of the population, probably more like 90% depending on the region, looking back at you with dark irises. Central Asia is where things start to get interesting. Parts of Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, regions with complicated ancestry mixing Asian, Middle Eastern and European populations, you start seeing more variation. But even here, brown usually holds the plurality, often the majority. Oceania, brown. Indigenous Australians, Pacific Islanders from Polynesia to Melanesia to Micronesia, dark eyes are the ancestral norm, the colour that arrived with the first people to reach those remote islands tens of thousands of years ago. Cross the ocean to the Americas and you find the same ancient pattern. Indigenous populations from the Arctic to Tierra del Fuego, from the Amazon to the Great Plains, overwhelmingly brown-eyed. The people who walked across the Bering Land Bridge maybe 15,000 or 20,000 or 30,000 years ago, depending on which dates you accept. They brought brown eyes with them, and those eyes remained dominant until European contact scrambled everything. So that's most of the planet. Africa, Asia, the Middle East, Oceania, indigenous Americas, billions of people, the vast majority of human genetic diversity, almost all of it brown-eyed. The entire southern hemisphere and most of the northern one painted in shades of dark amber to nearly black. Then you get to Europe, and suddenly the map changes colour. Europe, particularly northern and eastern Europe, is the main global exception to brown-eye dominance. In some Baltic countries, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, blue and grey eyes can reach 70% or 80% of the population. Scandinavia shows similar patterns. Iceland, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, regions where light eyes outnumber dark ones by wide margins. Parts of Germany, the Netherlands, Britain, you see high frequencies of blue and green. But even in Europe, the picture is more complicated than you might think. Southern Europe brings brown back into play. Spain, Portugal, Italy, Greece. Brown eyes are common, sometimes co-dominant with lighter shades. Move into Eastern Europe beyond the Baltic and you see the same thing. Poland, Romania, the Balkans. Brown competes with blue depending on the specific region and population. France sits somewhere in the middle, a genetic crossroads where both brown and lighter eyes are common. Same with parts of Central Europe. The idea that Europe is all blue eyes and blonde hair is a myth, one with some ugly historical baggage. Brown eyes have always been present across the continent, sometimes dominant, always significant. And here's where it gets really interesting. The United States, that great mixing bowl of global ancestry, gives you a snapshot of how all these patterns combine. A large survey from 2014 found about 45% of Americans have brown eyes. Blue came in second at 27%, hazel around 18%, green about 9%. Everything else barely registers. Think about that for a second. Despite centuries of massive immigration from Northern and Western Europe, despite the cultural weight those populations carried, despite everything, brown eyes are still the most common colour in America. By a lot. Because the genetic math is simple. You bring brown-eyed populations together with blue-eyed populations, and brown-associated genetic variants tend to dominate in the offspring. Not always. Not in the simple way your high school biology teacher probably described, but often enough that the numbers tell the story. The global hierarchy of eye colours is basically a rarity pyramid with brown at the bottom, wide and solid, supporting everything else. Roughly 70% to 79% of all humans have brown eyes, depending on which compilation you trust. Blue takes maybe 8% to 10%. Hazel perhaps 5%, green around 2%, making it the rarest common eye colour if that makes sense. Grey, amber, unusual shades including the pale grey or reddish eyes you sometimes see in albinism. They collectively make up a tiny fraction, a few percent at most. The numbers shift a bit depending on the survey. Some studies push brown as low as 55%. Others as high as 79%. The variation comes from sampling differences, from whether you count hazel as brown or separate, from whether you weight urban versus rural populations. But the broad picture never changes. Brown is the default setting, the colour that defines humanity's visual identity more than any other single trait. And all of this, every bit of this global distribution, is telling you something about deep time, about where we came from and how recently we left. Brown eyes are common because they're old, because they worked, because every population that ever faced intense sunlight, high UV exposure, tropical or subtropical environments, kept its dark irises and passed them down through hundreds of generations. Light eyes are rare because they're new. Experimental variants that emerged recently in specific populations under specific conditions, then spread through northern regions where the old rules didn't apply anymore. Beautiful, yes. Striking, absolutely. But fundamentally, they're footnotes in a story whose main text was written in brown. So when you look around your world and see mostly brown eyes, you're not seeing common. You're seeing ancient. You're seeing the colour that survived everything. the colour that watched the glaciers advance and retreat, that saw the first fires and the first tools, that looked up at stars from African plains before anyone knew what stars were. 3/4 of the planet is looking at the world through that same old lens. That's not default because it's boring. That's default because it's what works, what lasts, what remembers. So what actually makes an eye brown? What's happening in the tissue that creates that dark, light-absorbing colour that most of humanity carries? The answer is simpler than you might expect, and more elegant. Your iris, that thin ring of coloured tissue around your pupil, is not painted. There's no palette of pigments, no genetic instruction to mix blue here, green there, brown somewhere else. The entire spectrum of human eye colour, from the palest grey to the deepest black brown, comes from variations in a single substance, melanin, the same compound that colours your skin and hair. Everything you see when you look into someone's eyes, all that variation, all those supposedly different colours, is just different amounts and arrangements of one pigment. Let's start with the structure, because the architecture matters. The iris is essentially a muscular diaphragm, a dynamic piece of tissue that expands and contracts to control how much light enters your eye. It sits in front of your lens, behind your cornea, suspended in the fluid-filled space that makes up your eye's front chamber. When you need more light, the pupil dilates. When light is too bright, it constricts. This happens constantly, automatically, without you thinking about it. That muscular tissue is organized into layers. The back layer, the posterior pigment epithelium, is heavily pigmented in virtually everyone. Doesn't matter if your eyes are blue or brown or green or grey, that back layer is dark, loaded with melanin. Its job isn't to create colour. Its job is to block light from leaking through the iris from behind, to ensure that all the light entering your eye comes through the pupil, where your lens can focus it properly. The colour you actually see, the colour that defines someone's eyes, that comes from the front layer, the stroma. This is where the variation lives. The stroma is a fibrovascular tissue, a mesh of collagen fibres and cells and tiny blood vessels, and scattered throughout it are melanocytes, cells that produce and store melanin. In brown eyes, these melanocytes are abundant and busy. They're producing high concentrations of melanin, specifically eumelanin, the dark brownish-black form that's most effective at absorbing light. The melanin granules cluster densely in the stromal tissue, often concentrated in a thin anterior border layer right at the front surface of the iris. When light hits a brown iris, most of it doesn't come back out. The melanin absorbs it. Across nearly all wavelengths, red light, green light, blue light, the pigment captures them, converts them to heat, prevents them from reflecting back to an observer. What little light does escape is the warm brown spectrum that wasn't completely absorbed. That's why brown eyes look brown. Not because there's brown pigment, because there's so much dark pigment that only brown wavelengths survive the journey in and out. The darker the eyes, the more melanin. Deep brown, almost black irises have melanin packed so densely that virtually no light escapes. Lighter brown eyes, the honey or amber shades, they have somewhat less pigment, or the granules are distributed a bit differently, allowing a bit more light to reflect back. But the principle is the same, absorption. The iris is a light trap and melanin is the mechanism. Now here's where it gets interesting. What about eyes that aren't brown? Blue eyes, grey eyes, green eyes, they're not coloured by different pigments. There's no blue melanin, no green melanin. The melanocytes in lighter eyes are still producing the same eumelanin, they're just not producing very much of it. In a blue iris, the stroma has very little melanin. The tissue is relatively translucent, so light enters the iris, passes through that melanin-poor stroma, and hits the dark pigment epithelium at the back. The long wavelengths, reds and yellows and some greens, they get absorbed by that back layer, but the short wavelengths, the blues, and violets. They scatter. The collagen fibers in the stroma, the microscopic structures of the tissue itself, they scatter short-wavelength light preferentially. It's the same physics that makes the sky blue. Rayleigh scattering, or something very similar to it, often called Tyndall scattering in this context. The blue light bounces around in the stromal tissue and some of it escapes back out through the front of the iris. That's what you see. Not pigment. Structural colour. Physics. Green and hazel eyes sit somewhere in between. They have more melanin than blue eyes. Not enough to absorb most of the light, but enough to shift the balance. You get some scattering of short wavelengths, creating blue tones, but you also get some absorption and reflection of longer wavelengths, creating yellows and greens. Mix them together, and you get the complex shifting colours that make people write bad poetry. But brown eyes don't do any of that. They don't need to. The melanin concentration is high enough that scattering is irrelevant. The light gets absorbed before it has a chance to bounce around and create structural colour effects. What you see is pure pigment function, absorption and minimal reflection. Simple, effective, ancient. This also explains why iris colour can seem to shift slightly depending on lighting, on what someone's wearing, on how dilated their pupils are. The underlying melanin concentration doesn't change, at least not after early childhood when it stabilizes. But the physical context changes. Bright light makes pupils constrict, exposing more of the pigmented iris. Dim light dilates pupils, showing less. Different wavelengths of ambient light change what gets absorbed versus reflected. Surrounding colors, like a blue shirt or a green wall, can create subtle contrast effects that make the iris look slightly different. In brown eyes, these effects are minimal. There's enough pigment that the basic appearance stays consistent. But in lighter eyes, especially hazel or green, the structural color component means that these contextual effects can be more noticeable. People with light eyes sometimes insist their eyes change color. They're not wrong exactly. The perceived color is shifting. But the melanin, the biological reality underneath the appearance, that's stable. Usually by around age 6, maybe earlier in some kids, later in others, the melanin concentration in the iris has reached its adult levels. Studies tracking eye color over time suggest maybe 10% or 15% of people show noticeable changes after early childhood. Slight darkening or lightening, shifts from hazel to brown or blue to grey. But most people stay in the range they settled into as children. The genetic program runs its course, the melanocytes do their work, and then the colour is set for life. So that's the biology. That's what makes a brown eye brown. Dense melanin in the anterior stroma, absorbing most wavelengths of visible light, reflecting back only the warm tones that survive the filter. No complex colour mixing, no exotic pigments. Just one molecule, deployed at high concentration, doing the job it's been doing for hundreds of thousands of years. But this raises the obvious next question. If eye colour is just melanin, and melanin production is controlled by genes, then what exactly are those genes? What genetic instructions determine whether your iris melanocytes pack themselves with pigment or leave the stroma mostly clear? That answer, it turns out, is written on chromosome 15, in 2 genes that most people have never heard of. And the story of how we figured that out, how we traced brown eyes and blue eyes and everything in between to a handful of genetic switches, that's where things get really interesting. If you learned genetics in school, you probably learned something like this. Brown eyes are dominant. Blue eyes are recessive. 2 brown-eyed parents could carry a hidden blue gene and have a blue-eyed child. 2 blue-eyed parents only have blue genes, so their kids will definitely have blue eyes. Simple Mendelian inheritance. 1 gene, 2 alleles, done. It's a tidy story. Easy to remember, easy to test on standardized exams. And like most tidy stories about human biology, it's mostly wrong. not completely wrong. There's truth buried in there. Brown-associated genetic variants do tend to win out over blue-associated ones when they occur together. But calling it dominance and recessiveness at a single gene, that's like describing a symphony by humming the melody line. You're not exactly lying, but you're missing most of what's actually happening. The real story is far more complex and far more interesting. Human eye color is what geneticists call a polygenic trait. Multiple genes, each contributing something to the final outcome. Studies tracking pigmentation genetics across populations have identified at least 12 to 16 major genes that influence iris color, depending on how you count. Maybe more if you include variants with tiny effects that only show up in massive genome-wide screens. Genes like SLC24A4, which seems to fine-tune shades of brown and hazel. TYR, which encodes one of the key enzymes in melanin synthesis, and shows up in studies of eye color variation across Europe. IRF4, a transcription factor that helps regulate pigmentation pathways. SLC45A2, another melanin-related transporter. MC1R, better known for its role in red hair but also involved in subtle eye color variation. A whole network of genetic inputs, each tweaking melanin production up or down, shifting the balance between dark and light. But here's the thing. 2 genes account for most of the heavy lifting. Most of the actual difference between brown eyes and blue eyes, between the ancestral human phenotype and the derived variants that emerged more recently, that comes down to variation at 2 neighboring locations on chromosome 15, OCA2 and HERC2. Let's start with OCA2 because that's where the melanin story really lives. OCA2 encodes a protein called the P protein, a membrane transporter that sits in the melanosome, that specialized organelle inside melanocytes where melanin synthesis happens. The P protein's exact function is still being worked out, but the basic picture is clear. It helps regulate the chemical environment inside melanosomes, probably by transporting ions or small molecules that melanin synthesis depends on. More functional P protein generally means more efficient melanin production. More melanin means darker pigmentation, not just in the eyes. OCA2 affects skin and hair color too. Mutations that knock out OCA2 function entirely cause a form of albinism, one of the genetic conditions where melanin production is severely impaired across all pigmented tissues. But you don't need complete loss of function to see effects. Subtle differences in OCA2 expression, small changes in how much of the protein is made or how efficiently it works, those can shift pigmentation along the normal range, from dark brown to light brown to something light enough that other factors start dominating the appearance. So OCA2 is the workhorse, the gene that directly influences melanin production in iris melanocytes. If you want to understand why some people have brown eyes and others don't, OCA2 is where the action is. But here's where the genetics gets elegant. OCA2 itself doesn't vary that much between brown-eyed and blue-eyed people, at least not in ways that dramatically change the protein's function. The big difference, the variant that explains most blue versus brown variation in Europeans, isn't even in OCA2. It's in the gene next door, HERC2. HERC2 encodes a large protein involved in DNA repair and cellular regulation, and honestly, its main function has nothing obvious to do with pigmentation. But tucked inside intron 86 of HERC2, in the vast non-coding stretches of DNA between the gene's protein coding segments, there's a regulatory element, a genetic switch. And at one specific position in that regulatory element, there's a single nucleotide polymorphism, one letter of DNA that can be either a T or a C, RS12913832 if you want to look it up. The most important single genetic variant for predicting human eye color, the ancestral version, the T allele that was present in early humans and remains common across most of the world, that version promotes strong OCA2 expression. It does this by facilitating long-range interactions between the regulatory element in HERC2 and the promoter region of OCA2, the stretch of DNA that controls how much OCA2 protein gets made. The DNA loops around, transcription factors bind. The whole regulatory machinery engages, and OCA2 expression stays high. Melanin production proceeds efficiently. Eyes stay brown. The derived version, the C allele that arose more recently, weakens that regulatory interaction. The enhancer doesn't loop as effectively to the OCA2 promoter. Transcription factor binding is reduced. OCA2 expression drops. Melanin production in the iris decreases. And if you inherit 2 copies of the C allele, one from each parent, your iris melanocytes produce so little melanin that the structural scattering effects dominate. Your eyes are blue. This is regulatory evolution at work. The protein itself hasn't changed. The enzymatic machinery for melanin synthesis is still intact, but the dial controlling how much of that machinery runs in your iris tissue, that dial has been turned way down. And this single variant, this one switch in the HERC2 regulatory region, can predict eye color with startling accuracy when combined with a small panel of other markers. Studies in European populations show around 90 to 95% prediction accuracy for blue versus brown eyes based primarily on genotype at this locus. That's remarkable for a complex trait. That's the kind of predictive power you expect from simple Mendelian inheritance. Except it's not simple at all. It's one key variant in a polygenic network that happens to have an outsized effect. So what about dominance? Why does brown still beat blue when the genetics is this complicated? Because of the dose-response relationship. If you inherit one T allele and one C allele, one copy promoting high OCA2 expression and one copy promoting low expression, you end up somewhere in between. But melanin production is threshold dependent. You don't need maximum OCA2 expression to get brown eyes. You just need enough. One functioning copy of the high expression allele is often sufficient to push melanin production into the brown range. Not always, because remember, there are other genes involved. SLC24A4 and IRF4, and all the others are adding their inputs, shifting things slightly. But usually one copy is enough. That's why brown looks dominant. Not because blue alleles are broken or inferior, but because brown-associated alleles produce enough melanin at half dose to mask the effect of the low expression variant on the other chromosome. It's probabilistic dominance, context-dependent, but strong enough that the old schoolbook model captures the basic pattern, even if it misses the mechanism entirely. And all those other genes? They're the reason hazel exists. The reason some people have amber eyes or grey or that hard-to-define green that seems to shift with the light. The OCA2HERC2 axis sets the baseline, determines whether you're in the high melanin or low melanin range. Then the other variants fine-tune things. A little more pigment here, a slightly different distribution there, maybe some variation in how the structural scattering interacts with residual melanin. Layer enough small effects together, and you get the full spectrum of human iris color. But strip all that away, go back to the core genetic architecture, and what you find is this. The brown-associated alleles are the original versions, the ancestral code, the variants that were present in early Homo sapiens and likely in the hominins before us. The low melanin variants, the ones that produce blue eyes and contribute to green and grey, they're derived mutations. Newer changes that reduce melanin production from the baseline that evolution established long ago. Brown isn't just the most common eye color, it's the default, the genetic starting point. And every lighter eye color Every blue and green and hazel iris in the world represents a departure from that ancient standard, a reduction in melanin, a turning down of the dial that human ancestors had kept at full strength for hundreds of thousands of years. So when did that dial start turning down? When did the first mutations arise that could carve lighter eyes out of the universal brown background? And more importantly, why? What advantage, if any, did lighter eyes provide? Or was it something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with preference, with choice, with the strange power of beauty in evolutionary history? That story begins 500,000 years ago, with dark eyes under an ancient sun, and populations that hadn't yet imagined any other way to see the world. 500,000 years ago, give or take 100,000, every human ancestor walking the African savanna had brown eyes, dark brown, the kind of deep pigmentation that looks almost black in certain light. No exceptions, no variation worth mentioning. Just melanin-rich irises, optimized for a world that hadn't yet imagined blue or green or any of the lighter shades that would come much later. We can say this with reasonable confidence, not because we have fossils of ancient eyeballs, those don't preserve, but because of what comparative genetics tells us about ancestral allele states. When you look at the genes that control eye colour across modern human populations, particularly at that critical HERC20CA2 regulatory region on chromosome 15, a pattern emerges. The brown-associated variants, the ones that promote high melanin production, they're not just common, they're ancestral. They're the versions that were present before populations diverged, before migration scattered humans across continents, before any of the lighter eye mutations arose. In African populations today, the high expression allele at HERC2RS129133832, that regulatory switch we talked about, it's nearly fixed. Close to 100%. Same in East Asian populations, same in indigenous populations across the Americas and Oceania. Every major human lineage that split off early from the African source populations carries overwhelming frequencies of the brown eye genotype. This isn't random. This is the signature of an ancestral state. The genetic configuration that was present in our common ancestors before selection or drift or migration started creating regional differences. Go back further to species that preceded us, and the picture becomes even clearer. Homo heidelbergensis, the species that lived roughly 600,000 to 200,000 years ago and likely gave rise to both modern humans and Neanderthals, they almost certainly had dark eyes. We can't sequence their pigmentation genes directly from most fossils, the DNA is too degraded, but we can infer from their descendants, from the fact that both modern humans and Neanderthals carry high melanin pigmentation as the baseline, from the broader pattern across mammals, where dark irises are the overwhelming norm rather than the exception. Nearly 80% of all humans alive today have brown eyes, but that's a recent dilution, a result of the last 10,000 years of population mixing and the spread of light eye variants through certain regional populations. For most of our species' history, for the vast majority of the time that anatomically modern humans have existed, the percentage was higher, much higher, probably close to 100% until very recently in evolutionary terms. Ancient DNA gives us a window into this deep history. When researchers extract genetic material from human remains dating to the Upper Paleolithic or Mesolithic, roughly 40,000 to 10,000 years ago, and run those genomes through predictive models for eye color, the results come back overwhelmingly brown. Pre-Holocene individuals, the people who lived before the end of the last ice age, they carry the high melanin genotypes at OCA2 and HERC2. Not always. There are exceptions we'll get to. But the baseline, the default, the configuration you'd expect if you grabbed a random person from 20,000 years ago, that's brown. This isn't just a human story. It's a primate story, a mammal story. Dark irises are the rule across our entire evolutionary lineage. Look at chimpanzees, our closest living relatives. Brown eyes, almost universally. Gorillas, bonobos, orangutans, all the great apes, dark eyes. Go further back to Old World monkeys, New World monkeys, prosimians, same pattern. High melanin in the iris is the ancestral condition for primates. It's what natural selection settled on tens of millions of years ago, and for most of human evolution, we didn't deviate from that template. So when you imagine early Homo sapiens, the people who first developed the skeletal and cognitive features we associate with modern humanity roughly 300,000 years ago in Africa, picture them with dark eyes. When they watched the sun set over the East African Rift Valley, when they tracked game across grasslands, when they sat around fires telling stories in the early evening, they looked at their world through brown irises. Every single one of them. That was the only option genetics had provided. The same was true for the first humans who walked out of Africa. The initial migration, probably sometime between 70 and 60,000 years ago, involved a small founding population, maybe a few hundred individuals, maybe a few thousand. But genetically they were a subset of African diversity. They carried the alleles that were common in their source population. And at the pigmentation loci, particularly the eye color genes, those alleles were overwhelmingly the high melanin variants. Brown eyes on the journey across Arabia, brown eyes reaching into South Asia, brown eyes spreading through the coastland of the Indian Ocean, and eventually into Southeast Asia and Australia. For tens of thousands of years after leaving Africa, these expanding populations remained dark-eyed. The mutations that would eventually produce blue and green eyes either hadn't arisen yet or were vanishingly rare, present maybe as single copies in isolated individuals, but not spreading, not reaching frequencies where they'd show up reliably in the archaeological record. Even our extinct cousins, the other human species that shared the world with Homo sapiens until relatively recently, they fit this pattern. Neanderthals, who split from our lineage perhaps 600,000 years ago and evolved in Europe and Western Asia, we have actual genetic data from them now. Multiple Neanderthal genomes have been sequenced from fossils across their range, and when researchers look at the pigmentation genes in those ancient genomes, they find something interesting. Variation. More variation than in modern African populations, actually, probably because Neanderthals have been isolated and evolving independently for hundreds of thousands of years. Some Neanderthal individuals carry genetic variants associated with lighter skin and possibly lighter eyes. There's evidence that red hair might have existed in some Neanderthal populations, but look at specific individuals where we have good genomic data, like 3 Neanderthal women from southeastern Europe, whose remains were exceptionally well preserved, and the genetic prediction comes back dark. Brown eyes, dark skin. The baseline pigmentation profile that their ancestors had carried out of Africa 500,000 years before. The Denisovans, that mysterious third human species we know mostly from genetic data rather than fossils, they seem to have been dark-eyed as well. The best sequenced Denisovan individual, a young girl whose finger bone was found in Denisova Cave in Siberia, and dated to somewhere between 76,000 and 52,000 years ago, she carries genetic variants associated in modern humans with dark skin, brown hair, and brown eyes. This is a hominin lineage that split from the modern human Neanderthal ancestor maybe 800,000 years ago, that diverged early and evolved in isolation in Asia for hundreds of millennia, and still the genetic signature points to dark eyes. This is the secret hidden in plain sight. Brown isn't just common because it's dominant in the genetic sense, though that's part of it. Brown is common because it's old, ancient, the baseline configuration that evolution established deep in our primate past, and that humans carried forward essentially unchanged for the vast majority of our existence as a species. The high melanin iris that most humans still possess, that roughly 70 to 80% of the global population looks through every day, that's not a recent adaptation. It's not something that evolved in response to modern environments or recent selection pressures. It's the original equipment, the eyes that watched every major transition in human evolution, the eyes that saw the controlled use of fire, the eyes that witnessed the first sophisticated stone tools, the eyes that looked across the savannah when our ancestors first began to think symbolically, to create art, to bury their dead with ritual. Every innovation in human culture for hundreds of thousands of years was seen through brown eyes. Every migration across continents, every encounter between different human populations, every adaptation to new environments, from tropical forests to Arctic tundra, initially accomplished by people who all shared this one trait: dark irises, melanin-rich eyes that had been the human standard since before our species was recognizably human. And then something changed. Not everywhere, not in most populations, but in a few isolated groups, probably somewhere in Eurasia, probably during or after the last ice age. Mutations arose that began turning down the melanin dial. Variants that reduced OCA2 expression, variants that shifted the balance toward less pigmentation. The beginning of the end of the universal brown eye world, the moment when human eyes began exploring other possibilities, other colors, other ways of seeing light. But that moment came late, remarkably late, and understanding just how late, how recent the phenomenon of light eyes really is, that requires us to follow those African emigrants as they spread across the world, to trace the paths they took, the bottlenecks they passed through, the places where populations became isolated and began evolving in new directions. Because the story of blue eyes isn't just about a mutation, it's about migration, survival, and the strange paths that evolution sometimes takes when populations find themselves in new worlds, facing new pressures, making new choices about what matters in a partner or a child, or a face seen across a fire in the long northern twilight. That journey begins where all human journeys begin: Africa. With a small group preparing to leave, not knowing they were about to change the future of human genetics forever. They didn't leave all at once. For thousands of years, small groups of Homo sapiens pushed out of Africa in fits and starts. A few families following a river north, a band of hunters tracing antelope herds into slightly drier country. Generations later, their descendants edging toward a coastline they'd never seen before. Geneticists looking backward through time see a pattern hiding in the genomes of almost everyone outside Africa today. A contraction, a squeeze. At some point roughly between 70 and 50,000 years ago, a relatively small number of African people became the ancestors of nearly all non-Africans alive now. Maybe a few thousand breeding individuals, maybe less. That's a bottleneck. You can picture it as a neck of a bottle, but it might be more helpful to think of it as a narrow mountain pass. On one side, the wide, genetically rich plains of Africa, full of varied populations and countless genetic combinations. On the other side, the vast, mostly empty landscapes of Eurasia, and in between, a tight passage that only a small subset of humans actually walked through. Those who passed carried only a fraction of the genetic diversity that existed back home. Many rare variants were left behind. Some were lost forever when African lineages later went extinct, but the core toolkit, the genes that mattered most for survival, made it through. And among those core genes were the same pigmentation alleles your ancestors had been carrying for hundreds of thousands of years. The high melanin switches at OCA2 and HERC2, the brown eye configuration. Everyone who crossed that pass looked out at the new world through dark irises. From there, the story branches. One route hugs the shoreline. Anthropologists call it the southern dispersal. Small groups crossed what is now the Red Sea. probably at a time when sea levels were lower and the gap narrower, and found themselves in Arabia. Not the dry, empty desert we imagine today, but a patchwork of grasslands, lakes, and seasonal rivers that came and went as ice ages pulsed. These people followed the coast eastward, keeping the ocean on one side like a guiding line, through southern Arabia, along the shores of the Indian Ocean, skirting what would later be called India, moving through lush coastal forests and mangrove swamps, collecting shellfish, fishing in shallow bays, hunting in the inland hills, and returning to the safety of the shoreline. Generation after generation their descendants continued, into Southeast Asia, island hopping through Indonesia, and eventually reaching what is now Australia and New Guinea. By about 50 to 60,000 years ago, humans were living there, far from their African homeland, separated by thousands of miles and entire oceans. Their languages were different. Their tools were adapting to new environments. Their myths and stories, if we could hear them, would be unrecognizable. But their eyes were still brown. Another route went north. Some early modern humans moved into the Levant, the eastern Mediterranean, places that would later be called Israel, Lebanon, Syria. There they met Neanderthals, who had been living in Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years. For a while our species and theirs overlapped, traded genes, perhaps shared techniques, perhaps competed. Then climate shifted, populations moved, and modern humans receded for a time. Later waves came again. They pushed out of northeastern Africa into the Sinai, up into the Fertile Crescent, then fanned out across Central Asia. Some followed rivers through the steppe. Others skirted mountain ranges, finding passes into Europe. By about 45,000 years ago, Homo sapiens were in Europe in substantial numbers, moving into a continent shaped by ice sheets, cold winds, and vast herds of megafauna. Over time they would replace Neanderthals, though not before exchanging DNA with them. In these northern lands, sunlight came in different angles and amounts. Winters were long and dim. Summers brought extended twilight. Ultraviolet radiation was weaker than in equatorial Africa. Diets shifted toward animal fats, fish, and seasonal plants. Social structures adapted to harsh seasonal environments. But for tens of thousands of years, even here, the overwhelming majority of eyes remained dark. Ancient DNA from Mesolithic European hunter-gatherers, from people who lived 12 or 15,000 years ago in forests and along ice-fringed coasts, comes back again and again with brown-associated genotypes at OCA2 and HERC2. There are hints of lighter variants beginning to appear, but they are outliers, not norms. The world was still overwhelmingly a brown-eyed world. If the out-of-Africa bottleneck squeezed human diversity, why didn't it squeeze out brown? Because bottlenecks don't hit all genes equally. They are random with respect to most traits, but some variants have a head start. The ancestral brown eye alleles were already near universal before the migration. They sat in the genetic core that almost nobody lacked. When a few thousand people left Africa, they carried those alleles almost automatically, like everyone else around them. What got pruned were the rare quirks, unusual mutations, local oddities that hadn't had time to spread. At the major pigmentation loci, there just weren't many different options to prune. Dark eyes sailed through the bottleneck essentially untouched. At the same time, the bottleneck did something subtle but important for the future of eye colour. It created many small, scattered populations. On the long march across Eurasia, humans did not move as one big herd. They broke into bands of perhaps a few dozen people. A clan might settle in a valley and stay there for generations. Another might move on, following herds. Some groups expanded rapidly. Others dwindled to a handful, hanging on in marginal environments. In such tiny populations, chance starts to matter a lot. This is genetic drift. Imagine a new mutation appears in one child in a small band. Maybe it slightly reduces melanin production in the iris. Not enough to make the eyes look strikingly different. Perhaps just a touch lighter, a slight hazel where everyone else is dark brown. At first, it means almost nothing. The child grows up, has children of their own. Some inherit the variant, some don't, purely by chance. In a large, well-mixed population of tens of thousands, that mutation would probably stay rare or vanish. In a tiny, isolated group of a few dozen, it can drift. If, by luck, more descendants with the variant survive a bad winter or a disease outbreak, its frequency can jump. Over a few hundred generations, what started as a single accident in the DNA of one person can become common in an entire region. During the repeated advances and retreats of the Ice Age, human populations in Eurasia were repeatedly cut off from one another in ecological refuges. Peninsulas like Iberia and Italy, valleys in the Balkans, sheltered zones in the Near East. Each refuge was a kind of laboratory where drift and selection had room to work. Through this long process, rare variants at pigmentation genes, including those that tweak the HERC2OCA2 switch and reduce melanin in the iris, could survive. They didn't have to be advantageous yet. They just had to not be fatal and to be a little lucky in where they landed. Then the environment began to tilt in their favour. As humans settled at higher latitudes, the balance of risks and benefits for pigmentation changed. In intense equatorial sun, dark skin and dark eyes protect against ultraviolet damage. In regions with weaker UV, particularly where winter diets grew poor in vitamin D, very heavy pigmentation might become slightly costly. Bodies that admit more light through skin and perhaps even eyes might synthesize more vitamin D, though how much eye color itself mattered here is still debated. At the same time, social structures were changing. Populations were stabilizing, growing, forming more complex communities. Partners were no longer chosen only for their ability to track game or withstand cold. Subtle preferences could begin to matter. Slightly unusual eye colors, if they appeared, might draw attention. In small groups, preference for a novel trait can spread quickly, especially once language, stories, and ideas about beauty come into play. Most of this was still in the future, though. During the Great Dispersal out of Africa, nothing in the ice or wind announced that eye color was about to become interesting. People moved, hunted, raised children, buried their dead, all under the quiet rule of brown. But somewhere along these routes, perhaps in a band hugging a Baltic shoreline, perhaps in a group sheltering in the Caucasus, perhaps earlier, in West Asia as the first modern humans met Neanderthals, a tiny change slipped into the code. A single nucleotide in the regulatory region near OCA2, a microscopic switch in a stretch of DNA on chromosome 15. One version kept the ancestral high melanin setting. The new one turned it down just a bit. No one noticed. The baby looked up at their parents with dark eyes like everyone else. The mutation waited, carried silently through generations of brown-eyed faces. In time, as climates warmed and ice sheets retreated, as human networks thickened and cultures blossomed, that quiet variant would find itself in the right place, at the right time, to reveal something the human eye had never seen before. A flash of clear, pale colour carved out of the ancient brown. The moment when blue stepped out of the long shadow of brown eyes was still thousands of years away. But its story began here, in the wake of the Out of Africa journey, in scattered bands of dark-eyed people moving through new worlds, carrying within them the possibility of entirely new ways for light to meet the human gaze. The mutation itself was nothing dramatic. No missing chromosome, no shattered gene. Just a single letter change in a stretch of DNA that doesn't even code for a protein. a tiny swap tucked deep inside a gene called HERC2 in an intron that earlier generations of biologists would have been tempted to call junk. On a map of the genome, you'd barely glance at it. A point labelled RS 12,913,832 on chromosome 15. And yet, if you have blue eyes, that little point is almost certainly part of your story. To understand what it did, you have to remember the brown eye machinery your ancestors were already carrying. The OCA2 gene nearby, building a protein that helps melanin get into pigment cells, the ancestral HERC2 configuration acting like a powerful enhancer switch, looping the DNA so that OCA2 turns on loud and strong in the iris. That combination, high OCA2 activity, lots of melanin, is what made the world brown-eyed for hundreds of thousands of years. The ancestral version of RS129138332 keeps that enhancer running hot. It lets certain transcription factors grip the DNA, pull it into the right shape, and crank up OCA2. The result is a dark, melanin-rich iris. The derived version, the blue-eye version, does something extremely simple and extremely consequential. It weakens the grip, change that single base, and the enhancer works less efficiently. The looping is poorer, the contact with OCA2's promoter isn't as strong, the gene doesn't shout quite as loudly. OCA2 expression drops. Melanin production in the iris drops with it. In skin, hair, elsewhere in the body, all the ancestral machinery keeps chugging along. But in the thin, delicate ring of muscle and connective tissue around the pupil, the pigment is suddenly sparse. When this altered enhancer is present in just one copy, one chromosome with the new variant, one with the old, the result is often in between. Hazel, light brown, greenish. Colours we'll come back to later. When it's present in two copies, both chromosomes carrying the reduced activity enhancer, OCA2 gets turned down far enough that melanin almost vanishes from the front layers of the iris. What remains is not really a pigment at all, but an effect of light scattering in a largely unpigmented tissue. We call that effect blue. For a long time, geneticists thought they could pinpoint when this happened. Early work, looking only at living people and the diversity patterns of RS129138332 in modern Europe, tried to run the clock backward. The model suggested a story. Perhaps somewhere around 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, near the Black Sea region, one person acquired this mutation. Their descendants spread north and west with early farming communities. The blue-eye switch rode with them. It was a clean, elegant picture, almost too elegant. Then people started pulling DNA out of ancient bones. Mesolithic hunter-gatherers from what is now Spain, living perhaps 8,000 years ago, came back from the sequencing machines with something unexpected. Dark skin pigmentation genetics, but the blue-eye variant at RS129138332 already present, sometimes at very high frequency. Individuals from Scandinavia, from the same general period, showed the same pattern. Brownish skin, blue-associated alleles in the eyes. Even a few late Upper Paleolithic people, 14,000 years old, living in a Europe still shaking off the ice, carried the derived HERC2 variant. If blue eyes had only just arisen in the early farming villages of the Black Sea, they shouldn't already be sitting in these older forager skeletons, so the models had to be revised. Instead of a brand new Holocene invention, blue-eye genetics began to look older. Not ancient in the scale of our species, not 500,000 years, but probably tens of thousands. Estimates now range widely. Some researchers place the origin of RS129138332 somewhere between 30 and 50,000 years ago, perhaps as modern humans were moving through the Near East or into Europe. Others argue for a slightly more recent date. No single place has been agreed on. the Caucasus, the Levant, regions around the Black Sea, northern Anatolia, all have been proposed. The data we have point to an origin somewhere outside Africa, after the main out-of-Africa dispersal, but before the end of the Ice Age. Whatever valley or shoreline it first appeared in, the early story of the mutation seems to be one of patience. For a long time, thousands, maybe tens of thousands of years, the blue-eye allele drifted along at low or moderate frequencies. It was there, but it wasn't taking over. Ancient DNA from different parts of Eurasia shows it popping up in some groups, absent in others, never yet dominant across the continent. Then something changed. When you look at the genetic time series, modern and ancient genomes together, you see a pattern. In parts of Europe, especially the north, the frequency of the blue-eye variant starts to climb sharply in the last 6 to 10,000 years. From scattered appearances in Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, to strong presence in some early farmers, to near fixation in certain later populations. In evolutionary terms, that's fast. Too fast for drift alone in large connected populations unless they're repeatedly bottlenecked. The pattern looks like selection of some kind, leaning gently but steadily in favour of lighter eyes. Why? Here the story becomes more speculative. Several hypotheses sit on the table, and they don't necessarily exclude one another. One is sexual selection. In small farming villages and growing communities, once survival is no longer a daily knife edge for every individual, preferences can accumulate. A rare eye colour in a mostly brown-eyed world would be noticeable. Humans are sensitive to faces, to tiny differences. If some people began to find pale eyes striking, unusual, story-worthy, that preference could shape mate choice. Imagine a region where the first fully blue-eyed individuals appear. Not many, just a few. If they're slightly more likely to be chosen as partners, they'll have slightly more children, or their children will find mates more easily. That tiny advantage, generation after generation, can move an allele through a population in surprisingly short time. Another idea turns back to the sky. At high latitudes, winter sunlight is thin and ultraviolet is weak. Light skin is known to have been favoured there, probably because it helps with vitamin D synthesis in conditions of low UV and limited dietary sources. It's possible that some of the genetic architecture for lighter eyes is tangled up by physical linkage with variants that lighten skin or otherwise affect vitamin D metabolism. Selection for one trait can pull a nearby region of DNA along for the ride. In that case, the blue-eye allele might have benefited indirectly from pressures that weren't about eyes at all. There's also the simpler possibility of relaxed selection. In equatorial Africa, dark pigmentation in eyes and skin protects against intense UV damage. In northern Europe, that pressure is greatly reduced. If brown eye alleles were no longer especially favoured, and if populations were small and sometimes cut off, drift could more easily push alternative variants, including blue-eye ones, upward. Most likely the real history is a braid of all these forces, some sexual selection, some linkage to other traits under natural selection, some random genetic drift amplified by repeated bottlenecks as communities split, moved, and sometimes crashed. What we can say is that, even at the peak of blue-eye frequencies in northern Europe, brown never disappeared. The ancestral enhancer configuration at HERC2, the high melanin variants at OCA2, those didn't go away. They remained common, especially in southern Europe, in people whose ancestors had more contact with populations from the Near East and North Africa. Even in countries where a majority of people have blue or green eyes today, plenty still carry the brown-associated alleles. Blue did not erase brown. It carved a new shape out of it. At the molecular level, nothing about the blue-eye mutation is about adding something new. It's subtraction, a softening. turning down an existing signal until the old, dark baseline recedes and light can play differently in the iris. On the human timescale, the effect feels enormous. Think of the first children in some late Ice Age camp whose irises, instead of matching the deep, familiar brown of their parents, shone lighter, clearer in the low sun. Think of the stories that might have grown around them. Sky-eyed, ice-eyed, sea-eyed. We can't know exactly what anyone thought. Language leaves no fossils, but the DNA does tell us this. Every blue eye alive today, from the Baltic to Buenos Aires, traces back to that same enhancer variant at RS 129-13832 or its close relatives. A single regulatory tweak in a population of dark-eyed people, magnified by luck, by climate, by preference, by the strange currents of history. And under every blue eye, the old machinery of brown still hums. The ancient OCA2 gene, the ancestral melanin pathways. The dominant trait that ruled for 500,000 years never left. It simply allowed, in one corner of the world, a new way for light to meet the human gaze. From that one change, other shades would follow. Green, hazel, grey, amber. All of them riffs on the same theme. All of them carved in different ways from the long, deep river of brown. If blue is subtraction taken almost to the limit, then the other light colours are where evolution stopped halfway and started improvising. Because the genome didn't just flip a single brown to blue switch and walk away. It kept tinkering. Turn OCA2 down a bit, but not all the way. Add a variant in some other pigment gene that shifts the balance of melanin types. Nudge the collagen fibres in the iris stroma so they scatter light differently. Repeat that, not in one gene, but in 10, 15, maybe more. What you get from that kind of layered polygenic tinkering is not a neat palette with 3 or 4 discrete options. You get a spectrum, a sliding scale between deep brown and almost colourless, with stretches along the way where light and pigment combine in strange, rare and beautiful ways. Green, hazel, amber, grey. They're not separate categories wired into the genome like checkboxes. They're waypoints on the river between dark and pale, created by particular combinations of small effects. Take green. On a molecular level, there is no green pigment for human eyes the way there is for, say, a parrot's feathers. What people call green is an illusion built from layers. First, you need more melanin than a blue eye, but less than a brown one. Not the dense uniform curtain of pigment you see in ancestral irises, but a thin veil of colour in the stroma, the front, fibrous layer of the iris, enough to give a faint amber or light brown base. Then you keep the scattering. Just like in blue eyes, light enters the stroma and bounces off the collagen fibres there. Shorter, bluer wavelengths scatter more efficiently, washing the iris with that pale internal sky blue. Finally you mix in yellow. Some irises carry small amounts of yellowish compounds, often grouped under the name lipochrome, along with melanin. When that yellow overlays a light brown base and is lit from within by scattered blue, the human brain reads the blend as green, low to moderate melanin, Rayleigh-like scattering off the iris stroma. A hint of yellow pigment. No step by itself is dramatic. Together they make one of the rarest eye colours on Earth. Globally, something like 2% of people have green eyes, maybe a bit more, maybe a bit less, depending on which survey you trust. Almost all of them trace back, in one way or another, to regions along the old northern migration routes. Northern and Western Europe, Central Europe, fringe areas of Western Asia, Ireland and Scotland, where the blue eye mutation climbed to high frequency, also carry green at notable levels. So do parts of Iceland, the Netherlands, Germany, the Baltic coast. Pockets appear in the Caucasus, in Iran, in communities where ancient northern and southern lineages have mingled. If blue was carved from brown in Ice Age and early Holocene Eurasia, Green seems to be one of the intermediate shades that arose as those same populations mixed, settled, and remixed. A byproduct of partial melanin reduction, new scattering patterns, and the quiet arrival of those yellowish pigments. Now move a step back toward brown, and you reach hazel. Hazel is common enough that you've probably seen it many times, and yet it resists simple definition. Look at the same pair of hazel eyes at noon and at dusk, indoors and out, and they seem to shift. Brown in one light, greenish in another, flecks of gold or grey emerging as the pupil shrinks and expands. Biologically, that flickering quality comes from uneven melanin distribution. Instead of a uniform layer of pigment, hazel irises often have more melanin around the pupil and less toward the outer edge. The stroma may be mottled, patches of denser pigment next to lighter, more scattering-dominated regions. When the pupil contracts, new parts of that pattern come into view. When it dilates, others recede. The average melanin level in hazel eyes sits between brown and green, enough pigment to give a recognizable brown or golden tone, but not so much that it drowns out the scattering. Short wavelengths still bounce around inside the stroma, adding a soft greenish or greyish haze over the deeper colours. Globally, hazel seems to account for a few percent of people. Rough estimates hover around 5% worldwide, but its geographic pattern is different from blue or green. It shows up wherever populations with very dark eyes and populations with lighter eyes have overlapped for long periods. The Levant and parts of the Middle East, North Africa, the Iberian Peninsula, the Balkans, Latin America, North America, with its centuries of admixture, places where genes from high melanin ancestors and low melanin ancestors have been shuffling together generation after generation. From a genetic point of view, hazel often looks like what you'd expect when one chromosome carries more brown-leaning alleles and the other more blue-leaning ones, not just at HERC2 and OCA2, but across a network of pigmentation genes. Neither side wins outright. The result is a compromise written in light. Go in a different direction from green, and the spectrum takes on a metallic sheen. Amber eyes are rarer than hazel, probably in the low single digits globally. Unlike hazel, they're usually not mottled. They look like someone poured molten honey or copper into the iris and let it cool. Here, the melanin is generally low to moderate, but the yellow and red components are doing more of the visible work. Human melanin isn't all one kind. We make eumelanin, which is brown-black, and pheomelanin, which has red-yellow tones. The relative amounts of these, plus lipochrome-like pigments, can tilt the iris away from grey-blue and toward gold. In amber eyes, the scattering that makes blue less prominent because the base colour of the stroma is already warm. Light filtering through that tissue comes back with wavelengths shifted toward yellow and orange. The iris doesn't need much structural trickery to look golden. The pigment itself is warm enough. You see amber in scattered pockets. Parts of Europe, the Middle East, some regions of Asia and South America. Once again, it tends to appear where different ancestral lineages have met. Eurasian steppe, Mediterranean crossings, old trade routes where people and their genes have intertwined. Then, at the pale end of the spectrum opposite brown, there is grey. To an untrained eye, grey can seem like just a washed-out blue, but under magnification, and in the physics of it, it's different. Grey irises have extremely low melanin, like blue ones, but the structure of the stroma is denser, the collagen fibres arranged in a way that scatters light more uniformly. Instead of strongly favouring short, blue wavelengths, the iris scatters a broader range. The result is not a clear sky blue, but a desaturated, smoky tone, steel rather than sapphire. Estimates for grey eyes hover around 1 to 3% of the global population. They cluster in many of the same northern and eastern European regions where blue is common. Scandinavia, the Baltic, parts of Russia, but they appear elsewhere as well, often at the edges of different genetic landscapes. If you zoom out from any one colour and look at the whole pattern, a theme emerges. None of these shades, green, hazel, amber, grey, are driven by a single master mutation, the way the main blue versus brown contrast is strongly tied to that HERC2 enhancer. Instead, genome-wide studies keep finding a constellation of smaller players, SLC24A4, which affects pigmentation in skin and hair as well as eyes, TYR, involved in the first steps of melanin synthesis, other Locyon chromosomes 5, 14 and beyond. Each variant tweaks melanin levels a little higher or lower, shifts the balance of eumelanin and pheomelanin, alters how the iris tissue is built. No one of them dictates, this eye shall be green, but certain combinations make green more likely, others favour hazel, others tip toward amber or grey. Polygenic traits behave like this. Each allele is a nudge, not a command, and those nudges don't arise in isolation. They travel through history inside people, inside families, inside migrating groups that meet and mix and part again. Over thousands of years, ancient brown-eyed farmers from the Near East intermarry with blue-eye-enriched foragers in Europe. Steppe herders carrying their own pigment variants sweep west and south. Traders cross the Sahara. Sailors cross the Atlantic. Every encounter is a shuffle of these tiny switches. Every child is a new combination. That's why so many of the world's rare intermediate eye colours are concentrated in borderlands, geographic and cultural frontiers where very different ancestries overlap. They are quite literally hybrid colours, visible records of long-ago meetings, of caravans and invasions and marriages that braided separate lineages together. From a distance, the story can sound almost mechanical. Alleles rising and falling, scattering coefficients changing. But in everyday life it plays out in quieter, more human ways. A child is born in a family where everyone has deep brown eyes and their irises glow unexpectedly light, with a ring of green or gold. Somewhere in their genome, ancient high melanin variants from Africa, the Near East or South Asia have met lighter eye variants that travelled through Ice Age Europe. The bottlenecks, the expansions, the speciation events you heard about earlier, all of that distant drama now converges in a single gaze, and even there, in the rarest shades, brown has not truly gone away. Every green, hazel, amber or grey eye still depends on the same basic machinery that made the world dark-eyed for 500,000 years. OCA2 and its regulators. Melanin pathways refined long before any human had ever seen a temperate forest or an Ice Age glacier. The dominant trait is still humming beneath the surface, merely moderated, rearranged, partially veiled. These rarer colours are not rebellions against brown so much as quiet variations on its theme. Whispers in a language that was once spoken only in deep, dark tones. As humans kept moving, as sunlight and climate and chance shaped different regions, those whispers began to matter in new ways. Because in some parts of the world, under some skies, the old logic that had favoured dark irises would start to relax, and the deep brown baseline, once nearly universal, would find itself sharing the stage with its own lighter reflections. Imagine standing with those ancestors not in an Ice Age forest or a misty northern plain, but under the kind of sky they knew first, high noon near the equator. The light is not gentle, it is vertical, hard, full of ultraviolet. The air itself seems to glow, shadows are sharp as blades, every surface throws light back at you. In that kind of world, brown doesn't just look different, it behaves differently. Inside the iris, melanin is doing quiet physics. The same pigment that darkens skin and hair is layered in the front and back walls of your iris, especially in the stroma and the pigmented epithelium behind it. In dark eyes, those layers are dense with eumelanin, the brown-black form of the molecule. It doesn't just sit there passively, it absorbs. Ultraviolet radiation, high-energy blue light, scattered glare from rocks and water and sand. A lot of that energy gets swallowed in the iris before it ever reaches the deeper machinery of sight. The lens, the retinal pigment epithelium, the macula, that tiny delicate patch at the center of your field of vision that lets you read, track and recognize faces. Too much radiation there over years means trouble. Oxidative damage, fraying proteins, cells that slowly give up. Modern medicine gives those problems long names: age-related macular degeneration, cataract, uveal melanoma. They are diseases of accumulation, of tiny insults repeated across a lifetime. And melanin, sitting in the iris like a built-in filter, takes some of those insults first. If you map eye color onto the Earth today, you can see the outline of that story from orbit. Around the equator and through much of the tropics, across most of Africa, South Asia, Oceania, Central and South America, almost everyone has dark irises. Surveys differ on the exact figures, but in many of those regions, brown accounts for the overwhelming majority of eyes, sometimes essentially all of them. As you move away from the equator, the pattern loosens. In the Mediterranean and the Middle East, brown still dominates, but hazel and lighter shades begin to appear. Push into Central and Northern Europe, into the Baltic and the Nordic countries, and the spectrum inverts. Blue, green, grey, and their hybrids can make up most of the population there. Brown becomes the minority colour. Eye colour is not the only trait with that shape. Skin pigmentation follows a similar gradient. Deep tones common in high, UV zones, lighter tones more frequent at higher latitudes where the sun sits lower in the sky and spends more time filtered through atmosphere. It would be tidy if evolution came with captions. This trait exists because of that environment, but biology is rarely so explicit. All we have are patterns, mechanisms, and risk curves. The mechanism is straightforward. Melanin is a photon sink. It absorbs ultraviolet and blue wavelengths that carry enough energy to damage DNA and proteins. In the iris and the uveal tract, the vascular layer of the eye behind it, more melanin means more shielding. Less of that energy makes it to the retina and the supporting cells that keep vision sharp. Clinical studies in the modern world see echoes of that protection. People with light irises, blue, grey, green, on average report more glare sensitivity. Bright days feel harsher. Snowfields and beaches are less forgiving. Ophthalmologists are used to hearing patients with very light eyes say that they squint more, reach for sunglasses sooner, feel the sun more strongly. For some conditions, the differences show up in the statistics as well. Uveal melanoma, a rare but serious cancer of the eye's pigment cells, is noticeably more common in people with light eyes and fair complexions. Meta-analyses suggest that, compared with dark irises, light ones carry something like a 1.5 to nearly 2-fold higher risk. Not a guarantee, not a sentence, just a tilt in the odds. The disease itself also follows a latitude pattern. In northern European countries with large light-eyed populations, Norway, Denmark, Ireland, incidence is several times higher than in southern, darker-eyed populations such as Spain or parts of southern Italy. Again, nothing absolute, just a map that rhymes with a map of pigmentation. Age-related macular degeneration shows a similar set of hints. Organizations that focus on the disease routinely list excessive UV and blue light as aggravating factors and point out that melanin in the eye helps block those wavelengths. Darker eyes seem, on average, a little less prone to glare and perhaps a bit more buffered against certain kinds of light-induced wear. None of this means that brown eyes are magical shields or that light eyes are fragile. Only a small fraction of the ultraviolet in sunlight ever reaches the deep structures of the eye in the first place. The cornea and lens already block a lot. Skin colour, time spent outdoors, latitude, altitude, the habit of squinting under a hat brim or wearing a veil, all of these shape how much radiation your eyes see over a lifetime. Modern studies themselves disagree on exactly how strong the UV disease link is for any given condition. Some find clear associations, others see weaker ones. The picture is suggestive rather than conclusive, but from an evolutionary perspective, suggestive can still matter. Our ancestors were not living in climate-controlled buildings behind windshields and tinted glass. They hunted, gathered, worked and travelled under open skies, often in landscapes where shade was sparse, day after day, year after year, lifetime after lifetime. In that context, even a modest reduction in glare, even a slight drop in the odds of UV-related damage that might steal vision in middle age, could translate into real advantages. A hunter who can still see clearly at 40 and 50, a caregiver who can still spot subtle signs of illness in grandchildren. In small bands of foragers, those years of extra competence can be the difference between a group that holds together and one that fails. Brown eyes, packed with melanin, may have been one of many traits that nudged those odds. Not a lone hero trait, marching through natural selection by itself, but part of a suite of adaptations tuned to the same harsh brightness. Darker skin, hair that shields the scalp, behavioral habits around shade, early versions of head coverings and shelters. At low latitudes, under unforgiving suns, the combined effect of those traits was likely reinforced, generation after generation. Genes that reduced melanin too far in the iris or skin would have paid a small price. Not catastrophic, but just enough to keep the population's average firmly in the dark range. Move that same ancestral genome far to the north, and the equation starts to change. UV levels drop. The sun spends more time low on the horizon, light filtered through thick air. Winters grow longer and dimmer. Days of weak, grey light outnumber days of sharp, bright glare. Under those conditions, the penalty for having less melanin in the iris shrinks. There is simply less damaging radiation to worry about. A light-eyed hunter on a cloudy Baltic shore is not facing the same optical onslaught as a dark-eyed herder on an East African savanna. At the same time, other pressures begin to speak up. Skin needs to balance protection from UV with the production of vitamin D, which depends on sunlight. In high latitudes with low UV, lighter skin can make it easier to synthesize enough of that vitamin, especially in populations whose diets are not rich in it. Whether eye color itself helped with light capture in those environments is more speculative, but what matters for evolution is that the strong, consistent push toward maximum melanin relaxed. Once that push weakens, new variants have room to move. Mutations that slightly reduce OCA2 expression in the iris or tweak other pigment genes no longer carry much cost. Genetic drift can raise their frequency by chance. Sexual selection can amplify them if, for cultural or aesthetic reasons, people in small communities start preferring partners with unusual lighter eyes. Over thousands of years in those northern and temperate refuges, that is exactly what the DNA record suggests happened. The blue eye-associated switch near HERC 2/OCA2 appears, then gradually climbs in frequency. Additional variants nudge the spectrum outward into green, grey, amber. The old dark baseline doesn't vanish, but it stops being the only melody. Seen from that angle, brown eyes stop looking like a neutral background that evolution later decorated with colour, and more like a working solution to a very old problem. How do you build an eye that can stare down equatorial sunlight, that can track movement across blazing savanna, that can watch for predators or prey when the air itself is flooded with radiation? You build it with melanin. You line the iris with a natural sunscreen. You accept a bit less internal brightness in exchange for long-term durability. And you carry that design forward generation after generation, until it becomes so common, so quietly reliable, that later humans forget it was ever an adaptation at all. Today, under artificial lights and through tinted windows, that ancient logic feels far away. People notice blue or green because they are rare, because they flash in photographs, because they have acquired stories of their own. But for most of our species' history, for something like 500,000 years, the eyes looking out across the world were dark, not by accident, not just because nothing else had been invented yet, because under harsh suns, brown worked. For a long time, everything you've just heard about brown eyes and ancient suns was, in a sense, an educated guess. We had modern patterns, we had physics, we had bones and tools and burial sites, but we didn't have the actual genomes of the people who used those tools or lay in those graves. We were reading history from shadows. Then, quietly, in cold rooms full of centrifuges and freezers, that changed. Ancient DNA work is, at heart, an exercise in patience and caution. You start with a bone that has been in the ground for thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of years. Most of the DNA in it is gone. What remains is fragmented, chemically damaged, mixed with the DNA of soil microbes and every modern human who has ever touched it. To get to the ancient genome, you go for the densest parts of the skeleton, the inner ear region of the temporal bone, deep within the skull, or the roots of teeth, or the thick shafts of long bones. Places where the hard tissue has shielded tiny threads of DNA from water, oxygen, and time. Technicians shave off milligrams of powder in clean rooms where stray skin cells are the enemy. They dissolve the bone, pull out the DNA fragments, and start copying them billions of times until there is enough to run through a sequencer. What comes back is not a tidy double helix. It's a blizzard of short, damaged pieces, like a document shredded, burned at the edges, and soaked in acid. Bioinformaticians line those pieces up against a reference genome, stitch them together statistically, and with a lot of error checking and humility, begin to rebuild the genetic profile of a person who died before writing was invented. Once you have that profile, something remarkable happens. You can ask it questions, not just who were their relatives, but what did their body probably look like? Specific positions in the genome, tiny genetic switches called SNPs, are linked in living people to traits like skin tone, hair color, and eye color. HERC2 and OCA2 for iris pigmentation, SLC24A5, SLC45A2, and others for skin, MC1R for hair. By comparing the ancient person's combination of variants to huge modern databases, you can estimate probabilities. Darker or lighter skin, higher or lower melanin in the iris, the odds of blue versus brown. It is never perfectly certain. Many ancient genomes are low coverage, and our models are built on present-day populations, not Mesolithic villages. But the results are often clear enough to be startling. The most famous of those jolts, at least for Europe, lay in a cave in southwest England. Cheddar Gorge, a skeleton, about 10,000 years old, discovered in the 1900s, and known simply as Cheddar Man. For generations he was pictured as people assumed ancient Britons must have looked. Pale-skinned, light-eyed, an early version of later Europeans. Then, in the late 2000s, his DNA was sequenced. The prediction that came out of that data did not match the old illustrations. Cheddar Man, a hunter-gatherer wandering a chilly, post-glacial Britain, almost certainly had dark, possibly very dark skin. Dark, curly hair, and eyes that were blue or blue-green. Not the modern Northern European pattern, light skin, light eyes, but a combination that in today's Britain would look unusual. The announcement made headlines. Some researchers pointed out that any reconstruction is a probability map, not a photograph. Others emphasize that pigmentation is a spectrum, and new finds, like other Mesolithic individuals from France and Belgium, hint at more variation than a single portrait can show. But on the broad strokes, Cheddar Man was not an outlier. He belonged to what geneticists call Western hunter-gatherers, Mesolithic Europeans whose remains have now been sequenced in Spain, Luxembourg, Hungary, and beyond. Again and again, the same pattern shows up. At the HERC 2/OCA2 region, many of them carry the derived variants associated in modern people with blue eyes or very light irises. At key skin pigmentation genes, they often retain the ancestral darker skin versions. In other words, in much of Mesolithic Western Europe, eye colour appears to have lightened before skin colour did. Under low northern suns, in forests and along cold rivers, you have communities where dark skin and blue or blue-green eyes were common pairings. Modern intuition, trained on contemporary Europeans, tends to flip that. We expect light eyes to go with light skin. Ancient DNA quietly says that's a recent arrangement, and brown eyes, even here, had not gone away. The blue-eye linked switch in HERC 2/OCA2 isn't the only player. Other variants scattered across the genome still shape how much melanin ends up in each iris. In some Mesolithic individuals, the genetic dice still come up dark. The surprises do not stop in the forests. Shift your gaze southeast to Anatolia and the Near East, around 8,000 to 9,000 years ago. Here, small farming villages are taking shape. Domestic wheat and barley being coaxed from wild grasses, sheep and goats beginning their long partnership with humans. The people in these Neolithic communities also now have sequenced genomes. Their pigmentation package looks different. At SLC 24A5, a gene with a strong effect on skin tone, the derived light skin variant seems to have been common, perhaps even fixed. Reconstruction suggests that many early Anatolian farmers already had comparatively lighter skin, closer to what we think of as classic Southern European tones, while carrying hair that was usually dark. Their eyes, though, often look genetically like yours if you have brown irises. The brown-associated alleles at HERC 2/OCA2 dominate. Statistical models predict a high likelihood of dark or medium brown eyes for many of these early farmers. In other words, lighter skin, brown eyes. The near reverse of those Western hunter-gatherers with darker skin and light irises. When those farmers began moving into Europe, following rivers up from the Balkans, edging along Mediterranean coasts, climbing into the lowest plains of Central Europe, they did not arrive in an empty land. They met the hunter-gatherers who were already there. For thousands of years, the two ways of life overlapped, sometimes separated by landscape and habit, sometimes sharing valleys and eventually sharing genes. Later still, during the Bronze Age, a third major strand joined the braid. Herders from the western Eurasian steppe, groups related to what archaeologists call the Yamnaya and their descendants. Their genomes suggest intermediate skin tones, mostly brown eyes, dark hair. 3 ancestral packages, each with its own balance of melanin in skin and iris, slowly blending across the continent. When you look at maps of modern European eye colour, you're seeing that blending written in pigment. In the Baltic and parts of Scandinavia, the frequencies of blue and grey eyes climb high, reflecting a strong contribution from hunter-gatherer and certain steppe-derived lineages, plus later selection. In the Balkans, Italy, Greece and much of Iberia, brown and hazel hold their ground, echoing the legacy of Anatolian farmers and other southern populations. In between, shades mix. Germany, France, Britain, Poland, each a slightly different compromise between old components. Geneticists can still see those ancient threads in living DNA. There are gradients, clines, where the proportion of ancestry from Western hunter-gatherers, early Near Eastern farmers, and steppe herders shifts gradually from region to region. Eye colour follows those gradients, not perfectly, but recognisably. Brown may be less common here than in the tropics, but it remains a major player, especially where farmer or steppe ancestry is strong. Blue and green are more common where the old hunter-gatherer contribution runs deeper. The pattern is mosaic, not uniform, and it is young in evolutionary terms. Most of these admixture events have unfolded over the last 8,000 years or so, a brief flicker compared to the hundreds of thousands of years when brown eyes were, almost everywhere, the rule. If you step outside Europe in the ancient DNA record, that rule comes back into focus. Early skeletons from East Asia, from the ancient Americas, from sub-Saharan Africa, where the DNA is good enough to check, overwhelmingly carry the ancestral variants at HERC2/OCA2, the ones that in modern people are tightly linked to brown or very dark eyes. There are complexities. Different populations have their own subtle modifiers. Some Native American groups, for example, carry steppe-related ancestry from ancient Siberia that adds its own flavour. Sampling is still thin in many regions, and new finds could revise details. But the broad outline holds. The explosion of light eye colours, the rich palette of blues and greens and greys that people tend to notice and write poems about, is, as far as we can tell so far, largely a Western Eurasian story. A regional tweak to a global template. That global template is brown. Ancient DNA has not dethroned it. If anything, it has deepened its claim. Each sequenced genome from a Pleistocene cave or a Neolithic village is another small confirmation that wherever humans went, through ice and forest and steppe, brown eyes walked first. Later, in some corners, new switches flicked, and light carved colour out of that darkness. But even in the lands where blue eyes eventually took off, the old alleles, the old melanin-rich irises did not vanish. They wove themselves into the new mixtures, persisted in some lineages, reappeared in others. If your eyes are brown, ancient DNA is telling you something simple and surprisingly intimate. Your iris carries a pattern that has survived climatic whiplash, migrations, famines, and cultural revolutions. A pattern so successful that it appears again and again in genomes pulled from caves, burial mounds, and forgotten villages across the world. In the next chapters of the story, the focus will narrow to those lighter colours, to the strange history of blue and the myths that have grown up around dominance and recessiveness. But under all of that, running quietly, the ancient genomes keep repeating the same refrain. For most of human time, in most of human places, the world looked out through brown eyes. If genetics tells us what eyes are made of, culture tells us what they mean. For as long as humans have been telling stories, we have been talking about eyes, not in the way we do now, with charts and percentages and gene names, but with metaphors, with gods and monsters and lovers whose gaze could heal you or undo you. And for almost all of that time those eyes were dark. Start on the Nile. In ancient Egypt, one of the most powerful symbols in the entire religious universe was not a pyramid, or a falcon, or the sun. It was an eye. The eye of Horus, the Wedja, appears on coffins, boats, jewellery, temple walls, always stylized, always watchful, a dark pigmented eye, lined and curved, framed by the markings of a falcon. In myth, that eye is wounded and then restored. It is torn out in Horus's battle with Set, then healed by the god Thoth. Because of that, it becomes a sign of wholeness, of recovery, of the idea that what has been damaged can be made complete again. People wore the eye of Horus as an amulet against harm. They painted it on the bows of ships so the boat could see the way. They carved it near offerings so the god's gaze would fall on the food and drink that sustained the dead in the afterlife. The Egyptians did not write long essays about its colour. They didn't need to. Their artists filled the eye with dark pigment, black or deep blue, echoing the irises they saw around them every day. When they imagined a gaze strong enough to protect a soul in the underworld, they gave it a brown eye's darkness. Move a little east to the lands between the Tigris and Euphrates. In Mesopotamian art, eyes are everywhere. Statues of worshippers from temples at Tel Asmar and other sites have oversized inlaid eyes, wide dark pupils set in white stone. They look almost startled, fixed in an eternal stare. Texts from the region hint at why. In some Sumerian and Akkadian writings, dark eyes are linked to beauty, reliability, desirability. A trustworthy person is someone whose gaze is steady, whose eyes are clear, not shifty or pale. Again, explicit colour terms are rare. These were societies where almost everyone you met had brown or very dark eyes. To call someone brown-eyed would have been like calling them breathing. You only bother to name the unusual. Shift west toward the Aegean and a different kind of noticing begins. The Greeks lived at a crossroads between darker Mediterranean populations and lighter-eyed peoples from further north and inland. In that mix, eyes start to stand out as a marker, something to talk about. Homer gives the goddess Athena a famous epithet, Glaukopis. If you open a modern translation of the Iliad or the Odyssey, you'll often see it rendered as grey-eyed or bright-eyed Athena. The underlying word glaukos is slippery. In early Greek, it seems to mean gleaming, silvery, shining like an owl's eyes. Later, it gets used for bluish-green seas, greyish tones, things that flash between blue and green. Scholars still argue over what colour Athena's eyes were imagined to be. Were they grey, green, blue-grey, or was the point not hue at all, but a kind of otherworldly luminosity? What those debates reveal is something deeper. The Greek language, like many ancient languages, blurred categories that we treat as separate. Blue and green were neighbours in a single semantic field. Colours were about brightness, movement, liveliness, not just wavelength. When a poet described someone's eyes as glaukos, they might not have meant this person has objectively green irises, so much as their gaze is sharp, uncanny, owl-like. And yet, beneath the metaphors, there is a quiet ethnic contrast. In other Greek and later Roman texts, lighter eyes, grey, blue, mixed, are sometimes associated with northern peoples, with Thracians, Scythians, Germans, barbarians, in the word of the time. Striking, yes, sometimes admired, sometimes distrusted. Roman authors inherit this habit. Latin love poetry often praises dark eyes as intensely erotic, smouldering. A beloved might be called black-eyed, the darkness linked to depth of feeling, to passion. At the same time, lighter eyes show up in descriptions of Gauls or Germans, outsiders at the edge of the empire. Pale eyes could be exotic, even beautiful, but they also carried connotations of wildness, strangeness, non-Roman identity. You can hear already an early version of a story that will become very loud centuries later. The pairing of certain eye colours with certain regions, certain peoples, certain hierarchies, but the text record itself is mixed. Brown eyes were the eyes of Rome, of most of Greece, of the majority of the Mediterranean. They were desirable, familiar, erotic. Light eyes were a shimmering minority trait, noticed precisely because they were rare. Turn your attention east and south, and something else appears, or rather fails to appear. In much of South Asia and East Asia, brown eyes were and remain almost universal. In many regions, more than 9 out of 10 people you meet today will have dark irises. Historical populations were likely similar. Read the classical poetry of these regions and you'll notice a pattern. Eyes are everywhere, but colour in the narrow iris sense is almost nowhere. In Sanskrit epics and love poems, in Tamil Sangam literature, in classical Chinese poetry and Japanese waka, Eyes are compared to lotuses, to moons, to deer, to flowing water. They are wide as autumn pools, slender as a new moon's curve, dough-like, almond-shaped. The focus is on shape, on motion, on the way a glance is cast and withdrawn. The eyes may be described as dark as night, but that darkness is metaphorical, oceanic, not the technical note iris brown. You can infer something from that silence. When almost everyone has brown eyes, the eye's shape and expression become the canvas for meaning. The actual pigment is background noise. In these cultures, brown eyes were so normal, so woven into the fabric of daily life, that writing "she had brown eyes" would have sounded as pointless as writing "she had a face." It is only very recently, in historical terms, that humans start talking about eye colour the way we do now. The shift begins in early modern Europe and intensifies in the 19th and 20th centuries. As European empires expand, as racial theories harden, certain Northern European features, pale skin, light hair, blue or green eyes, are elevated in pseudo-scientific hierarchies. Phrenologists measure skulls. Racial typologists sketch Nordic, Mediterranean, Negroid faces and rank them. In that context, blue and green eyes, already relatively common in Northern Europe thanks to the local genetic mix, are recast as markers of superiority. Stories are told about pure lineages, about ancient Aryans with shining eyes bringing civilization to darker-eyed peoples. These stories are not biology, they are politics, dressed up as science. But they seep into culture. Paintings, then photographs, then films, then television and advertising begin to over-represent light-eyed faces relative to their actual global frequency. Casting directors assume a certain look for leading roles. Romance novels describe piercing blue or emerald eyes as if those are the default objects of desire. Contact lenses appear, marketed to let brown-eyed wearers upgrade to blue or green. In some places, people bleach or tattoo their sclerae, lighten their hair, change whatever they can to fit an imported beauty template. All of this is happening in a world where, even today, the vast majority of humans, perhaps 2/3 or more, have brown eyes. In Africa, in most of Asia, in the Americas, in Oceania, dark irises remain the rule. Against that genetic backdrop, the Western elevation of blue and green eyes is not just recent. It is parochial. It takes a tiny, regionally common variant and treats it as if the universe had been waiting for it. Deep time tells a different story. For hundreds of thousands of years, from early Homo populations through archaic humans, through the entire rise of Homo sapiens, every love song, every myth about a god's terrible gaze, every fear of the evil eye, every line about a warrior whose stare could freeze an enemy, almost all of those eyes were brown. When an ancient Egyptian scribe wrote of a beloved's eyes as pools of coal, when a Sumerian poet praised a bride's sweet look, when an early Chinese poet spoke of eyes like autumn water, the irises behind those metaphors were almost certainly dark. When a mother, 200,000 years ago, stared into the face of her newborn somewhere in Africa and saw her own gaze reflected back, the colour she saw was brown, blue, green, grey, hazel. These are latecomers, variations carved out of a brown template in a few corners of the world over the last tens of thousands of years. They are striking, interesting, worthy of attention, but they are not original. Brown eyes are the original eyes of beauty, of grief, of rage, of quiet wonder. The eyes that watched the first sparks of controlled fire, that tracked herds across ice age plains, that looked up at unfamiliar constellations from islands newly reached by boat. In the last few decades, something has started to shift back toward that older perspective. As people around the world question Eurocentric standards, as conversations about race and representation become more open, there is a growing movement to decolonize beauty, to stop treating one narrow, historically loaded phenotype as the universal ideal. Fashion campaigns, films, television shows, social media feeds, they are still imperfect. But more and more you see brown eyes not just as anonymous background, but as focal points. A rich, almost golden brown framed in dark lashes, a deep, near-black iris that seems to hold more light than it reflects. The subtle variability within brown itself becoming visible, named, celebrated. People talk about their brown eyes with pride, not apology. They trace them back through parents and grandparents, across oceans and generations. They notice, maybe for the first time, that their eyes are not just brown, but the precise shade of wet earth after rain, or of strong tea held up to the sun. Genetics, history and culture are converging on the same quiet conclusion. The traits that were once marked as dominant or recessive, as superior or inferior, as civilized or barbarian, are simply variations on a very old theme. And that theme, the baseline, the canvas, the colour of almost every gaze that ever shaped our species' story, is brown. In the next part of this journey, we'll slip back toward the science classroom, to the Punnett squares, to the neat little diagrams that claim brown always beats blue. We'll see what those got right, what they missed, and why your eyes are not an elementary school puzzle, but a record of millions of years of trial, error, and survival. Back to the classroom for a moment. Fluorescent lights, laminated posters, the smell of dry erase markers and old textbooks. On the board, your teacher draws a simple square, splits it into 4, a Punnett square. They write a big capital B in a couple of corners, a little b in the others. They label one parent BB, the other BB, and start filling in the boxes. Brown is dominant, they say. Blue is recessive. So if you have at least one big B, your eyes are brown. Only BB gives you blue. They shade in 3 boxes, leave 1 unshaded. 2 brown-eyed parents, they explain, can have a blue-eyed child. But 2 blue-eyed parents, BB and BB, they can only ever have BB kids. So their children's eyes will always be blue. It's neat. It's tidy. It feels like a law of nature. And it's not entirely wrong. It matches a lot of families. It illustrates something real about how some genes work. But like a map that only shows main roads and ignores all the side streets, it leaves a lot out. Because out in the real world, in living families with living children, that last rule breaks. There have been blue-eyed couples who have given birth to brown-eyed children. Sometimes rare hazel that deepens with age. Sometimes eyes that are unmistakably brown. In the old days, people whispered about the mailman, about secrets, about infidelity. Today, geneticists look at the genome and shrug a little. Of course it can happen. The Punnett square you saw in school is based on an old idea that there is one eye colour gene with 2 versions, one for brown, one for blue, B and B. But when scientists started digging into the DNA, tracking millions of tiny changes across thousands of people, the picture that emerged was different. There isn't one eye colour gene, there is a whole committee. OCA2 and HERC2 on chromosome 15 are the loudest voices in the room. Variants in and around these genes account for much of the shift between very dark brown and very light blue in many populations. That's why textbooks talk about them, but sitting around the table with them are other genes. TYRP1, SLC45A2, SLC24, A4, ASIP, IRF4, TYR, and more. At least a handful, probably dozens, each nudging the amount and distribution of melanin in your iris up or down, sideways or inward. Each one brings a little instruction to the pigment-making machinery in your eye. Make more, make less, move it here, pack it there. The colour you see in the mirror is the sum of all their arguments. When researchers looked at just OCA2, for example, and asked a simple question. If you have the blue type at this spot on both chromosomes, do you actually have blue eyes? The answer was not 100%. It wasn't even close. In one analysis, only around 6 in 10 people with 2 blue versions at that main site had blue eyes. The others had hazel, green, or even light brown. And some people with 2 brown type versions there still had blue eyes. In other words, even at the big important loci, the so-called dominant and recessive versions don't act alone. Their effect depends on the rest of the genome. This is where a quiet word enters the story. Epistasis. It sounds like something from a medical chart, but it simply means this. The effect of one gene depends on what's happening at other genes. Imagine trying to describe how spicy a meal is by looking at just the chili peppers. That helps, but it's not enough. Maybe there's yogurt mixed in, or sugar, or something that blocks your ability to taste heat. Genes work like that. You can carry a version of a gene that, in theory, tells your cells to make a lot of melanin in the iris. But if another gene upstream lowers the volume on that signal, or diverts pigment production elsewhere in the body, the expected brown effect might not show up. Now put 2 blue-eyed parents under this lens. They might both have combinations of variants that together don't quite push their irises into brown territory. They fall somewhere in the light range, pale hazel, greyish blue, something your culture calls blue. But tucked away in each of their genomes are some strong pigment-boosting versions at other sites. In them, those alleles are mostly quiet or cancelled out by modifiers. In their child, by the roll of the genetic dice, those pigment boosters end up together without the same dampening factors. The total signal to make melanin here crosses some internal threshold, and the baby's eyes, which might start off grey or slate at birth, deepen over months and years into a warm brown. To a simple Punnett square drawn with B and B, this looks like an impossibility. To a polygenic system filled with interacting loci, it's just an uncommon combination. When you hear dominant and recessive in this context, it's tempting to think in absolutes. Brown beats blue, always, but dominance is not a moral quality. It's not about strength or superiority. It is a description of what you see when one allele is paired with another at the same locus. Which one shows up more in the phenotype? And even that description is slippery, because as soon as other genes get involved, the old labels start to blur. A brown type variant at OCA2 might look dominant over a blue type at that same spot in many genetic backgrounds. Add in certain combinations at TYRP1 or SLC24A4 though, and the visible effect can soften, shift, or even invert. Context matters. This is why, even with quite detailed genetic information, prediction models for eye color don't reach 100%. With several known variants plugged in, they can classify likely brown or likely blue with perhaps 3/4, maybe a bit more, accuracy in some populations. Useful, but far from perfect. Your eyes are not a lockstep code, they are a probability distribution. So why did the simpler story hang on so long? Why does the little square with its big B and small b still sit in so many classrooms? Partly because it works often enough. If you're teaching teenagers about how traits can pass from parents to children, you need clear examples. Mendel's peas, tall and short, yellow and green, smooth and wrinkled. Eye colour in many European families seems to line up roughly with this pattern. Brown tends to show up when at least one parent has it. 2 light-eyed parents usually do have light-eyed children. The outliers are rare, easy to ignore or explain away. For a long time, we also simply didn't have the tools to see the full picture. Before the genomics era, tracking 1 or 2 major loci was ambitious. The rest was guesswork. So textbooks condensed. They shaved off the complexity. They took a messy, many-gene story and pressed it into a form that would fit on a chalkboard. There is no malice in that. Just the normal lag between what cutting-edge research knows and what makes it into school diagrams. But the language that rode along with that simplification did have consequences. Dominant, recessive. In genetics, these are technical terms. In everyday speech, they became metaphors. Dominant sounded assertive, powerful, normal. Recessive sounded hidden, delicate, easily lost. In some corners of popular science writing, those connotations hardened into value judgments. Brown eyes, dominant, became strong genes or primitive genes as default. Blue eyes, recessive, were rare, fragile, a special. Layer on top of that the racial theories of the 19th and 20th centuries, the elevation of certain pale-skinned, light-eyed populations as higher types, and you get a strange swirl. The same blue eyes praised as recessive, unique, even magical, and yet somehow attached to supposed superiority. None of that maps cleanly onto the biology. Brown-associated variants are older, yes. They are more common globally, yes. That is because they have been around longer, and because for most of human history they were either neutral or slightly useful in the environments where we lived. Blue-associated variants are newer, more localized, and in some regions may have ridden waves of selection. Perhaps because they signaled something attractive, perhaps because of subtle environmental trade-offs. Neither set is better or worse in any absolute sense. There are adaptations and accidents woven into the same tapestry. If you strip away the metaphors and look again at the science with fresh eyes, the picture that emerges is less like a battlefield where brown tramples blue and more like a gradient, a continuous spectrum of iris pigmentation running from very dark brown through amber and hazel and green to light grey and blue, a spectrum shaped by dozens of genetic inputs, each one adding or subtracting a little melanin here, a little structural scattering there. Development plays its part too. Many babies are born with relatively light, cloudy eyes. As the pigment cells in the iris wake up over the first few years of life, melanin levels rise or stabilize and color shifts. Some eyes darken noticeably, others stay pale. Age has its say as well. Over decades, pigment can redistribute. Some brown eyes pick up golden flecks. Some light eyes become slightly darker or more mixed. Trauma, illness, and medications can nudge things further in rare cases. So the corrected picture looks less like a fixed label and more like a living process. Eye color is not a simple on-off switch between dominant brown and recessive blue. It is a probabilistic outcome of many interacting genes and life histories. Your biology teacher wasn't lying to you. They were giving you a first draft, a children's sketch of a cathedral. The real structure is more intricate, more interconnected, and in a quiet way, more beautiful. And once you understand that, the phrase brown is dominant stops sounding like shade. Parents take photos, grandparents speculate. They'll be blue like mine. No, look, there's brown coming in around the pupil. Just wait. For a while, the baby's eyes seem to hold their secret. Then, slowly, over months, the colour deepens. The grey gives way to green, hazel, or a soft brown that, by the first birthday, may be completely different from what anyone expected. What's happening is not magic. It's timing. At birth, the pigment cells in the iris, melanocytes, are not operating at full capacity. In many populations, especially those with a lot of light eye variants, these cells are still relatively quiet. They've made some melanin, but not much. The front layer of the iris is pale, the stroma is full of tiny structures that scatter light, and the combination reflects as blue or grey. Then the world turns on the lights. Over the first 6 to 12 months of life, those melanocytes wake up. They respond to internal developmental programs, to hormones, to the simple reality that photons are now streaming into the eye every waking moment. Slowly, they start packing more melanin into tiny granules and filling the iris with pigment. If the child carries a strong mix of brown-associated variants, at OCA2, HERC2, and their quieter partners, the signal is clear. Make a lot of melanin here. The cloudy blue of infancy deepens to nut brown, chestnut, near black. If the genetic instructions are more moderate, the result is a compromise. A light brown ring closest to the pupil, greenish or golden tones at the edge, hazel, green, all the in-between colours that Mendel's P's never warned you about. What looks like a change of mind is really a change in pigment load. The underlying genes were there from conception. It just took a while for the chemistry to catch up. Babies from populations where dark eyes are overwhelmingly common often skip the suspense. Their melanocytes are more active even before birth. The irises may be dark brown right from the start and stay that way, their colour as stable as the night sky. But even within the same family, siblings can follow different trajectories. One child's eyes hold on to a stormy grey, another's flip to brown by 6 months. The genetic committee is voting in each case, and the melanocytes are simply carrying out the orders. Sometimes, though, the orders are not uniform. Every now and then, you meet someone whose eyes do not match. One iris is brown, the other is blue or green, or one is brown with a bright wedge of blue cutting through it, like a slice of sky frozen in amber. This is heterochromia. Complete heterochromia is the striking version. Each eye a different colour. Sectoral or partial heterochromia is subtler. A portion of one iris, a sector, carries a different shade than the rest. There is also central heterochromia, where the region around the pupil forms a ring of contrasting colour. To the person in the mirror, it may just feel like an odd trick of fate. To a biologist, heterochromia is a reminder of how localized pigmentation really is. Because your iris is not painted as a single unit. It's a landscape of cells, each with its own microenvironment. Small differences in blood supply, in nerve input, in the signals that tell melanocytes how much melanin to make can produce islands of darker or lighter tissue. In some people, the genetic instructions are patchy. A mutation may occur early in development in one cluster of cells, but not others. The result is a mosaic, literally a different genetic pattern in one iris than in its neighbour. In others, the wiring of the sympathetic nervous system is altered on one side of the face, as in Horner syndrome, so that melanocytes on that side receive weaker activation. Over time, the affected eye may appear lighter, less pigmented. Most heterochromia is harmless, simply another variation in how melanin gets distributed. But because it can also be a sign of underlying conditions, inflammation, vascular problems, developmental syndromes, doctors take note when eye colours diverge dramatically or change suddenly. Even when both eyes match, though, the story doesn't necessarily end after infancy. Many people, especially those with mixed colours, hazel, green, grey-blue, report that their eye colour seems to drift over the years. The change is not usually dramatic. A dark brown eye does not turn ice blue in middle age, but a green eye can pick up more brown, softening toward hazel. A hazel eye can seem to brighten, especially in certain light, as the density and arrangement of melanin in the stroma shifts. The mechanisms here are still being pieced together. Long-term quantitative studies of eye colour across decades are rare. What we have are snapshots, clinical observations, and plausible biology. Melanocytes are active cells. They respond to hormones, to local inflammation, to aging. They can change how much melanin they make and where they store it. The collagenous stroma in front of them can thin or reorganize. Tiny changes in this layered structure alter how light scatters back out. That may be enough to nudge a hazel eye slightly greener, or a soft green a little browner. In some cases, the shifts are not just gentle drift, but the fingerprints of disease. Take Fuchs' heterochromic iridocyclitis, a chronic inflammation inside the eye. Over time, it can damage the iris on one side, reducing pigment and leaving that eye noticeably lighter. Or consider Horner syndrome again, where disruption of sympathetic nerves to one side of the face can, among other signs, leave one iris paler than the other. Pigment dispersion syndrome, where pigment granules rub off the back of the iris and circulate in the eye's fluid, can change the way the iris looks under bright light. Some glaucoma treatments, prostaglandin analog eye drops, go in the opposite direction. They signal melanocytes to pack more melanin into their granules. The number of pigment cells doesn't increase, but the pigment content per cell does. Over months, about 1/10 to 1/3 of patients on these medications, depending on study and baseline color, see their irises darken. The effect shows up most clearly in mixed eyes, green-brown, blue-brown, hazel, where the extra melanin shifts the balance toward brown. Uniformly blue eyes, with very little melanin to begin with, seem less likely to change. Very dark brown eyes, already saturated, have less room to move. The pattern across all these conditions and treatments is the same. Eye color is not paint that dries and then stays put forever. It is an ongoing negotiation between genes, cells, light, and time. Melanocytes in your iris are constantly maintaining, adjusting, sometimes quietly rewriting the pigment story that began before you were born. And because humans are never quite content to let biology be, we have tried, in our own ways, to take control of that story. Coloured contact lenses have been around for decades now. With a thin disc of patterned plastic, you can walk into a room with brown eyes and walk out with violet or leaf green or a pale grey that no natural genome has ever produced. Some lenses simply tint. Others use printed patterns to simulate the intricate radial lines of a real iris. More recently, a brief and controversial wave of iris implant surgeries promise something more permanent. Artificial coloured discs inserted in front of the natural iris. Originally designed for medical situations, to repair damaged irises, they were marketed in some places as cosmetic upgrades. The results, in too many cases, were not kind. Glare, chronic pain, elevated eye pressure, damage to the cornea. Many patients needed the implants removed. Some lost vision. Ophthalmologists sounded alarm after alarm. Most professional bodies now strongly discourage or outright condemn such surgeries for cosmetic reasons. And yet, the desire that drove them is revealing. In a world where brown eyes are the majority, maybe 2/3 or more of all humans, some cultures have elevated light eyes as rare, exotic, desirable. Others have celebrated the depth and warmth of dark irises. Fashion swings, ideals shift, but the underlying impulse is the same, to use colour, even in our eyes, as a canvas for identity, status, beauty. When you step back, another picture comes into focus. Those quiet brown eyes, the ones your grandparents had, the ones you might have now, are not static relics from a distant past. They are living tissues, full of cells taking constant care of a pigment system that has been with our lineage for hundreds of thousands of years. Every second you are awake, photons strike your iris. Melanocytes absorb, respond, repair. They replace worn-out melanin granules. They adapt slightly to the chemistry of your body and the demands of your environment. Blue, green, hazel, grey, all of them ride on top of that dynamic machinery. They appear when certain pathways dampen melanin production or redistribute it. They flicker and shift within the bounds that development and health allow. But underneath the day-to-day variations, there is a deeper continuity. The same processes that slowly darken a baby's slate grey eyes to brown are echoes of the same processes that coloured the eyes of Ice Age hunters, of Neanderthals, of the small scattered populations that survived ancient bottlenecks and fanned out across the world. Even when it looks still, your iris is in motion. Even when it looks simple, brown. It is the visible surface of a restless chemistry, maintaining molecule by molecule the colour that has watched our species rise, wander and wonder. In the next part of this story, we'll lean into that sense of continuity. We'll follow brown eyes back through time, across continents and climates, and see how a single shade can connect you to people you will never know, in worlds long vanished. Let them rest for a moment. If you're lying in the dark or watching with your eyes half closed, you don't have to move. Just let the lids drop, or let your gaze go soft. The outside world can blur. Instead, picture a single, clear thing. An eye. Not your own, not yet. Someone else's. Deep brown, almost black at the rim of the pupil, fading to a softer chestnut toward the edge. The surface glints with light, but underneath it's dense, saturated with pigment. Now let that eye pull back into a face. The skin is dark, the features are familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. The person is standing on open ground under a high African sun. The air is dry. Grasslands run out to a line of scrub and scattered trees. In the middle distance, animals move. Antelope, maybe. Some distant shapes too large and slow to be anything but elephants. This is not a few generations ago. This is 100, maybe 150,000 years back. Early Homo sapiens in East Africa. Anatomically modern humans. People who, if you passed them on a city sidewalk today in jeans and a t-shirt, you probably wouldn't look twice. You're looking into the eyes of one of them. Inside that iris, packed into tiny melanin granules, are alleles, small stretches of DNA, at places called OCA2 and HERC2 on chromosome 15. In this person, those alleles are the ancestral versions, the default human setting. They tell the melanocytes, make a lot of pigment, darken this iris. Almost everyone they know has the same instruction. For hundreds of thousands of years, that was simply how human eyes were. Dark, brown to near black. The variations that matter to us now, blue, green, grey, either did not exist yet or were so rare that entire regions went generations without seeing them. Stay with this one person. They live in a small band, maybe 30 or 40 people. They sleep near a fire. They know the taste of roasted tubers, of game meat dried in thin strips. They have stories, even if we'll never know the words. They watch children stumble and learn to walk. They grieve their dead. At some point, they have a child. The baby's eyes open for the first time, cloudy in the half-light of the shelter. Over months, just as in modern infants, the pigment cells in the iris ramp up. The colour settles into the same deep brown. In that transition, a genetic baton is passed. The OCA2 and HERC2 alleles that darken the parent's eyes are copied into the child's cells, not in a grand, ceremonial way, but in routine cell divisions in a fertilized egg. Molecules pairing and unpairing, enzymes proofreading, error checking. And then the process repeats, parent to child, child to grandchild. Over tens of thousands of years, through times of plenty and times of starvation, that same combination of ancestral brown eye variants moves down the generations. You can let the scenes flicker by. A group leaving their old range, following rivers that bend northward. The air grows cooler, skies grey more often. Their brown eyes still soak in the light, still shield the delicate retina from harsh glare when the clouds break. Another group moves east, across savannas, into forests, along coasts. The irises in their children are the same dark shade. The external world keeps changing. The internal recipe hardly does. Ice sheets advance and retreat far to the north. Sea levels rise and fall. Somewhere along the way, in a different branch of the human family tree, the blue-eye mutation appears. A tiny change in a regulatory stretch of HERC2 that partly quiets OCA2, lowering melanin levels in the iris. But for most of humanity, nothing obviously changes. Brown eyes look out on the first stone tools more refined than hand axes. They narrow against blowing sand in the Sahara. They watch the sun rise over the Himalayas. They scan rice paddies, wheat fields, maize fields, the ordered rows of the first farms. Through it all, certain alleles at RS12913832, the key switch in that HERC2 region, remain stubbornly ancestral in much of Africa, in parts of Asia, in places where brown eyes today reach frequencies close to 99%. Now pull the camera forward in time. Villages become towns, towns become cities. Writing appears, empires rise, settlers